webinars on the legal implications of Colorado's stay-at-home order. We're hosting a whole series of webinars to help people answer many of the questions we're facing as a result of COVID-19 here in Colorado, as well as across the nation and across the world. I do want to encourage you to ask questions either on Zoom or YouTube in the chat feature, and we'll do our best to answer them throughout the course of this webinar. Today, we're going to explore the legal implications. Oh, I'm getting a little feedback from YouTube here. Stand by. All right, we'll continue. Today, we're going to explore the legal implications of Colorado Governor Polis's stay-at-home order for COVID-19. What does this mean for Colorado citizens? What can and cannot be done under the order? And how does this affect your family? Today, we'll also provide an overview of federal and state power during an emergency. And friends, I couldn't be prouder to have one of my good friends helping us guide through these questions than Fred Yarger. Fred is a partner at the Denver office of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, where his practice focuses on complex litigation in trial and appellate courts, including cases involving administrative law and regulatory matters. Before joining the firm, Mr. Yarger served as Solicitor General for the state of Colorado, one of 3 senior leaders in the 450-person Department of Law. In that role, his primary responsibility was to lead and oversee the most challenging and high-profile trial and appellate litigation facing the state. Mr. Yarger has argued multiple merit cases and filed dozens of briefs before the U.S. Supreme Court, and many of his cases received intense national media attention. What an honor, blessing to have Mr. Yarger here to walk us through these issues. Now, I do want to caveat that Mr. Yarger is part of a dynamic duo, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention Katie Yarger, his brilliant wife, who served as a clerk for Justice Clarence Thomas, one of my favorite justices. And so, Fred, thank you so much for being a part of this, helping us understand the nuances of this order so that people can be prepared for the challenges we may face as a result of this. So, Fred, I'll turn it over to you. And I know you have a presentation that we'll walk through, but in the meantime, folks, ask questions throughout this, and we'll be sure to kind of have a dialogue throughout this. So, Fred, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and it's an honor to join you and your community here to talk about this issue and give my perspective on it. I look forward to your questions. Jeff, I'm gonna trust you to sift through them. I hope there are lots, and I hope we can get to many of them. But thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for mentioning my wife, and thank you for mentioning my favorite justice on the United States Supreme Court and one of my favorite people. He's a great American. So I am going to share my screen here, and I hope this all works. I am pretty new at webcasting. I was not a big webcaster before about 2 weeks ago, but I'm slowly becoming an expert. Jeff, can you see that presentation now on your screen?
Looks great.
Great. All right, so Jeff asked me to do a presentation and lead a discussion on the latest guidance that we just got this week from the state of Colorado. And obviously this comes on the heels of multiple orders that the state has issued in the days before that, and orders that have come from counties and cities as well. I'm going to focus on the statewide order because that affects all of us. And I'll sort of explain to a certain extent how that interacts with local authorities. But first, a brief introduction, which I don't need because Jeff did such a kind job introducing me. Again, I'm Fred Yarger. I think the reason Jeff was kind enough to have me on is I had served in state government for a number of years. I was Assistant Solicitor General under John Suthers when we had some interesting disaster issues come up, including the North Fork fire. So I got to see firsthand some of the emergency powers that the executive branch exercises in situations like these. And then for 4 years, I was proud to be the Solicitor General of the state of Colorado under Attorney General Cynthia Kaufman. And during that time, we had some fast-dating issues, some of which went up before the United States Supreme Court, and I had the privilege of arguing there. You'll see the picture here. There's the court sketch artist that does that picture, and I always like showing that in presentations because it's the only image you get from inside the courtroom. All right, so quick disclaimer, I'm not here to provide legal advice. This is an informational presentation only. I would love to answer your questions, but I can't give you legal advice. So first, the statewide order. This order was issued on Wednesday of this week, and it went into effect yesterday morning at 6 o'clock a.m. In fact, when I went out for a morning walk with my dog, I went to a park, I looked on a picnic table, and there was a notice saying, please don't use the picnic tables. So this is new for all of us. It's obviously a bit scary to be under an order from your state government to not do the things that we're used to doing, which includes going to restaurants, meeting with friends, and going to, for example, the mall, which I drove by and saw that it was completely empty. I've never seen that before. It was an interesting sight, to say the least. But this is a statewide order, and that's important because although county health authorities, including the city and county of Denver, where I live, including the tri-state health authority where many of you live, have ordered stay-at-home orders. This is an order that now applies to everywhere in the state, including mountain counties and obviously including some of our northern counties and rural counties. Under this order, those counties can impose more stringent requirements. The order specifically says that. So this isn't necessarily the whole story if you're living in one of those areas, but it is a big part of the story. The details of the order, it's interesting. If you read Governor Polis's order, it's pretty bare bones. And what he did is he referred the matter to the state health department to put specifics in place. And I urge you, if you have time and if you're curious, if you want to find the actual text of the authoritative order that is governing this situation, it's at the Colorado Department of Health and Public Environment website. That's where you'll find it. I've actually had folks ask me, where do I find this? I haven't actually seen the text of the order. That's where it is. It's pretty lengthy, but if you have the interest in doing so, that's where you'll find it. The order is effective. It was effective earlier this week, Thursday, yesterday at 6 a.m. It's going to go through at least Saturday, April 11th at 11:59, so effectively April 12th. And of course, it can be extended if the governor and the state health department agree that that's necessary. Now I'm going to walk through the substance of the order because I think it's important to understand that and understand how it's structured. So the main bulk of the order and the main headline and the one that most of us are interested in is the stay-at-home provision. And what that says is the state is ordering you, not suggesting anymore, this isn't a suggestion, but ordering people to stay at home, quote, whenever possible. Now that's obviously a little bit difficult to define, but what it means is you stay at home except for necessary activities, and that's defined in a whole separate section of the order, and I'll walk through that. If you do leave home, the order says that you have to practice what none of us heard of a couple of weeks ago, which is this concept of social distancing. And it defines what social distancing mean, at least in terms of this order. Again, I think local governments can go farther if they wish, but what that means is if you leave home, you have to have a 6-inch or 6 foot, not 6-inch, that wouldn't do much good, a 6-foot buffer between you and other people. You have to wash hands frequently, and then it gives guidelines. You have to use soap and water, and you have to wash for 20 seconds. You have to cover your coughs and sneezes with your elbow and take other measures. The next piece of this is that there are now no gatherings of any size. There was a period of time where the governor was ordering a workforce reduction of 50% for non-critical businesses. Now that doesn't exist, and in addition to that, there are no gatherings at all. You're allowed to be with your family, and that's it when you're out of the house. And then finally, and I'll give some caveats to that. There's some important caveats to getting outside and helping family members that are in need, even if they don't live in your household, or other vulnerable people that are within your community. And then finally, you have to self-isolate if you see symptoms. It doesn't define self-isolation. I think what that means is you try to separate yourself as much as possible, not only from folks outside your home, but folks inside your home. For me, I don't know how I would do that. I have 3 kids running around at home. So God forbid if I do get sick, that'll be a tough situation. But what that means is you self-isolate until you have no fever for 72 hours. Your other symptoms have passed. We've heard, obviously the cold, dry cough is the leading symptom that everybody's concerned about. And 7 days have passed since your symptoms have first appeared. Now, the next part of this, and this is the big caveat to the stay-at-home order, is necessary activities. There are many of them, and I'm not listing them all here, but essentially what that means is tasks essential to health and safety. It's the first category. And a lot of this is common sense. If you need medicine, you need to be able to get out of the house to get medicine. If you need to go to the doctor, you need to be able to go out of the house to do that, assuming your doctor is open and available. And, for many of us, that's meaning telemedicine right now. Secondly, you're allowed to go out and buy household supplies. That's not just limited to groceries, it's other necessary essentials. There are gas stations that are open. You can buy household goods that you need. You can also buy work at home equipment if you have a home office store that's open, things like that. Outdoor activity is permitted, which is good news for me because I don't know how I'd keep 3 kids in the house without letting them see some sunshine. But you can get outside to exercise, walk your dog, go hiking. You can even go skiing, I suppose, if you find a hill that you're willing to hike up and ski down. Most of the ski lifts are closed. I don't know if any that are open right now. State parks are open. Most city parks are open, but playgrounds are closed. Picnic areas are closed. I just read yesterday that campgrounds are closing. Obviously, federal property is also closing. The Rocky Mountain National Park, I believe, is closed now. The fourth category that I have up here, and this is important and I think critical for people to understand, is that you can leave your home to care for a family member that doesn't live with you. So I don't think you should feel constrained to do that. That's obviously terribly important, especially if you have somebody who's at risk in your family or your community. It's not limited to family members. It says other vulnerable persons. Doesn't define that, but I think common sense would tell you what that means. And then finally, you can leave home to work at a critical business, and that's complicated. It's detailed, and I'll discuss that in another slide. Necessary travel. Obviously, you have to leave the house in order to do necessary activities outside the house, but the order defines what necessary travel is. It also strongly encourages you not to travel if you can avoid it. That means interstate travel. So there was a concern when this was county by county that you weren't going to be able to leave the county and then come back. Now that this is statewide, as long as you're leaving your house for necessary activities, there shouldn't be any concern. I don't think in many cases there was a concern, except going to a workplace that wasn't critical, of leaving and coming back. But there's nothing in the order that suggests you can't leave, for example, to go to a state park outside of your county. Now that you'd have to look at your local order and see what that says about travel. But that's how I read the state order. You can also leave to receive educational materials and meals from schools. A lot of us are doing a stay-at-home school that is new to us. There's an allowance for that. You can return home from outside the state, which is good. I had a family member that was sort of trapped out of country for a period of time, and thank goodness they got home with some help from the State Department. But that's a key portion of this. And then travel required by law. They don't define that, but if you are required to travel for some reason, you of course can. Critical businesses, and this has been a big question for many of us. What is a critical business? There are 13 categories, and those categories are broad. And so you would have to read them in detail to figure out if your particular business was subject to this. Obviously, hospitals and clinics, doctors' offices are critical right now. Nobody would question that. Utilities, roads, farms, other infrastructure, growing food right now is something that you can leave your home to work on. Certain categories of manufacturing. I saw on the news today that the MyPillow gentleman from Michigan has his factory workers making surgical masks, which is great. So there's certain categories of manufacturing that are being allowed. Critical retail, news, including grocery stores. Firearm stores are accepted from the statewide order. I know that's not true everywhere. I don't know the full status of that in every county, but that's obviously been a point of contention in many places. It's not a subject of the statewide ban. News media are open, shelters, other service for the needy. Again, this is a sampling. If you really want the details, you're gonna have to read the order. It's lengthy and it's complicated. Banks are open, certain professional services, lawyers in certain circumstances can go to work, but that's all laid out in the order. Childcare is open. I don't know of many that are. I think voluntarily many have closed. Those are subject to additional restrictions though. And I know this is a time where it's very difficult for many people to get the childcare they need, even if they're working from home. So that is part of the order, but I think it's very local depending on how that's working. There's also an exception for minimal or minimum basic operations. And what that means is if you have a store and you need somebody on site to protect inventory, to do payroll functions and things like that, those functions are allowed. But the guidance is that it has to be minimal. It can be no more than the people who are necessary to do those activities. And you can't just go to work to stay open. And it lays out what that means, what minimum basic operations means. So that's for those non-critical businesses. The next category of exceptions is critical government functions. Obviously, we can't have a society without our public safety officers out there doing their jobs. Police stations, fire stations are open, transit is open. Of course, you can't use transit unless it's for necessary activities. I saw a bus on the street today, it was completely empty. I think obviously there are slowdowns in service, so you have to look into that. But this is a long list. It also includes airlines, taxis, and rideshare. So the transportation system obviously has some significant exceptions from this, but you have to read it carefully to understand what's going on. But everything that we need to respond to the emergency obviously needs to be open. So that really is the outline of the order and the broad strokes. I didn't cover everything. It's lengthy. It's a little bit complicated. I'm sure everybody has unique questions about it. And I think those are still being answered. But that is the basic structure of how this order is meant to work. I wanted to go briefly into enforcement because I think a lot of the questions are great. The state government now is telling me what I can't do. What if I'm out? What if I make a mistake? What if I'm not following the order? And I have two answers for you. One, I just want to talk strictly legally about what the consequences could be, but then I'll tell you what the state policy is about enforcement. So first, what are legally the consequences? They're pretty significant. Violating the order is a crime under state law. It is a misdemeanor, but that is still significant. And for the state, that means fines up to $1,000 a year of jail time. And you could be on the hook for a civil court or a court judgment, a monetary court judgment for the cost of enforcing that order and protecting public health and safety. Local penalties, both for this order and for other local orders, can actually be more significant. I think in Boulder, for example, the fine goes up to $5,000 and up to 18 months in prison, and that's a matter of local law. In addition to that, there are civil remedies that state officials and local officials can enforce. Loss of a liquor or restaurant license. There are all kinds of provisions in licensing, state and local, that require you to follow public health orders and other orders. That could obviously become an issue if you weren't following this and an enforcement official caught wind of it. Local officials also can simply go to court and ask a court to order a business or individual to comply, and then the court could use its contempt power, which means it itself could impose fines and other things and order you to comply. So it's significant. The actual technical remedies that are available to the state to enforce this. This is enforced by local law enforcement. That includes, peace officers who would see these activities going on and be the first steps in the process. District attorneys and county attorneys would then bring those cases. The Colorado Attorney General has some limited authority here. He can step in, particularly in the civil realm, and impose monetary remedies. But typically, this is going to be a local law enforcement issue. So that is the technical legal side of what can happen. What I want to emphasize, and this is straight from the lips of our Attorney General, what it seems to me is clear is that the goal is not punishment, but voluntary compliance, obviously, and most of us are doing that. It would be sort of far-fetched to think that if you accidentally met some friends at the park and violated the order against congregation, that there would be any serious problem. And so the Department of Public Safety, in conjunction with the Attorney General, is stating publicly that the recommendation is to first educate, reach out, and seek voluntary compliance. I think obviously the message here is they don't want people to be afraid of making a mistake and then getting in trouble. I don't think that's likely to happen unless something else is going on. You're being, obstructionist or something. And I very much doubt most people are doing that right now. So that's the technical side, and then that's the policy side. But those are the remedies. They're serious remedies. The Attorney General and some local authorities have emphasized that. And I think they want to make clear to everybody that this is a serious order with consequences if necessary. Jeff, I've been talking for a while. I don't know if it makes sense to pause here or go through the end. I'm happy to do either.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions, which is just fantastic. And maybe we can start broadly, and this will maybe be a good segue into the next section. But a lot of people are wondering, is the order a ban? How does the governor have this order, the capability to be able to do this? And then we can get into specifics. There's a lot of very specific questions, which we can maybe get to towards the end, which I really appreciate. And I think these are good questions. But a number of these questions are general in the sense of, how did we get to this place where the governor has this ability to be able to implement that? Maybe that's a segue into the kind of the next section you're going to talk about.
It is, yeah, and that's a great question. What I'll say is there's a specific statute that the governor invoked. It's the disaster emergency statute, and it lays out his ability to restrict travel and take other actions in times of emergency. He's already declared a state of emergency. That's the authority that he's using to act on. There are other state statutes that specifically empower local governments to address disease issues. I think those statutes are a little bit out of date and maybe not written specifically for this kind of a pandemic situation, but it's written in the statute. It's right there. The governor can take steps to limit travel in certain areas and take other actions against individual people in the state if there's an emergency in place. What is so remarkable about this, and remarkable about what is going on all over the country, is typically a disaster area is a flood zone or a fire zone. Or there was a case that I was reading the other day from the 10th Circuit where there were underground noxious gas leaks, just natural poisonous gases flowing out of the earth, and a county closed an entire housing subdivision. We've seen that before. That's localized, that's very disruptive, but it's rare, if ever, that we've seen this kind of statewide shutdown. I think you have to go back all the way to the Spanish flu pandemic of the early 1900s to see those kinds of orders. So it does make people, I think, a little bit concerned about where this power is coming from, but that is where it's coming from. And let me talk a little bit more about some of the legal and constitutional considerations that come into play. So first, folks tend to think that the federal government is extremely powerful in our system, and it is. It's wealthy. It has a lot of resources to throw around. But when it comes to on-the-ground policy that affects people within the center of a state, it really is supposed to be the state government that houses that authority. There's good reasons for that in our constitutional system. We want those decisions to be made as close to home as possible. So if you look at the authorities that the federal government has to quarantine and to isolate, they really focus on foreign travel, interstate travel. That's the authority that President Trump used when he closed down the borders with China. That's the authority that he used when he said, we're not accepting travelers from certain European countries as the crisis deepened. Those were the authorities that he has. Now, the CDC also has authority specifically to address dangers when people are starting to travel interstate, and there's a legitimate risk that they're going to spread a disease from one state to another. But mainly that typically comes in the form of assisting local governments, especially when an issue is this widespread, because the federal government doesn't have that many boots to put on the ground. The states do. And that's why you need state cooperation in a situation like this. The big thing the federal government can do is spend money. They can foot the bill for the National Guard to come out and help with disaster preparedness and setting up temporary hospitals. They can use authority, for example, under the Defense Procurement Act, I'm probably getting the name of that wrong, to take measures to start getting necessary goods in the hands of the people that need it. That's really the power of the federal government. The states are the ones that are on the ground. So where does this come from? States have what's called the general police power. In the federal system, the federal government doesn't have sort of general government powers. It has enumerated powers. All the powers that it doesn't have, it gives to the states, or it is reserved to the states. The states had those to begin with. So as John Hughes said, and that's the article I cited in the past slide, under the police power, only the states can impose quarantines throughout an entire population, which is what we have here. Only the states can close institutions and businesses, and only the states really have the power to limit local travel. So that's where it comes from. And it's important to keep that in mind. But for many years, even though we've rarely seen situations like this where the state has used the power so broadly, the courts and even the Supreme Court has assumed strongly that states have this power. There's a quote from a case. It was in a different context, but Justice Berger said there can be a little doubt that in the exercise of its police power, a state may confine individuals solely to protect society from the dangers of communicable disease. I guess that leads to the question, well, what are the limits here? State law authorizes it, the 10th Amendment, and the courts have clearly contemplated it, but are there any limits on it that the Constitution imposes? And certainly there are. The problem is we just haven't seen many cases where those limits have been litigated, and so the scope of those limits isn't entirely clear. The 10th Circuit, though, did in that case I mentioned where that subdivision closed down because of the gas leak, here a challenge to sort of a evacuation order that's akin to a quarantine order. And what it said is, it basically, this is legalese, the order can be upheld unless it's arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable. That's a pretty loose standard. It gives a lot of discretion to public officials to make the judgments that they need to make to impose these kinds of orders. Some commentators and courts have suggested other limits. I haven't seen many of those in published case law. But if there is a law that is targeted in some way, if it targeted a racial group or a religious group and did so intentionally, that would obviously be a huge constitutional issue, and courts have struck those down. So those are the kinds of concerns that courts would have. Courts are very reluctant to step in the middle of emergency situations and try to second guess the executive branches when they're making these decisions. So really, you have to start with state law, and you have to start with who you've put in office. Those are the places you're going to look for limits on these kinds of policy decisions, not really the courts. That's basically the message, if you kind of read between the lines of this precedent, that the courts are trying to suggest. And obviously, the other problem is courts act slowly. They're not great at intervening in emergencies. They're great at deliberation and coming to good decisions when they have time to think about them. They're not good at mobilizing and immediately acting. And that's why we give authority to governors and the president to act in times like these. So that's really the some of the basic and broad outlines of where the power comes from. It's a reflection of the fact that our state governments are supposed to be close to us and have all of the authorities that are not enumerated in the Constitution, and the federal government has enumerated powers, including the power to spend public resources to address emergencies. And so those are considerations, I think, for the future. Will policymakers want to revisit this and look at statutes, disaster relief statutes, and see if there are additional specific limitations or considerations they want to impose? Does the federal government want to try to expand that power and test that power? Certain regulations of the CDC suggest that the federal government could come in and do some of this local work. I don't know that they have the resources to, but that would be a significant constitutional test. So those are some of the broad outlines. And then, Jeff, I'm happy to jump in now with specific questions to the extent that discussion didn't answer them.
That's very helpful, Fred. Thank you. And I think one of the questions that I'm going to transition over to hear from Carol, but we learned kind of out of the blue the other day that an unelected bureaucrat could shut down and issue a stay-at-home order in 3 different counties without even in opposition to the elected officials. And so I think that's one of the questions that we're going to face once the kind of dust is settled on this. Do we want to change Colorado state law, which is where they got that power to implement that? So I think there'll be a lot of questions and a lot of debate and over the role of the states, federal governments, even the counties. But one question is, why do the counties, or why can they supersede a state order? So you mentioned that in Boulder County, for instance, they can have a harsher penalty over their community. Is it this notion of federalism, just county state federalism, basically, that allows them to issue more stringent orders?
That's actually an interesting point, and it's something that folks in Colorado ought to know. So first, it's within the text of the executive order. It says the counties and county health departments can be more stringent. So that kind of resolves that question really about the scope of orders, at least right there. But in terms of the broader point, there is sort of a form of federalism in the state of Colorado. It's called local control. And there is a sort of federalist type notion in state law that tries to decide what issues are purely local, and those are typically land use type issues. What issues are mixed state and local concern. I think here you might have sort of a mixed issue where clearly you have extreme local effects, but local issues become state issues if people are traveling around the state and carrying disease. And then you have issues of purely statewide concern. Most issues are mixed concern. In most areas, state and local authorities share power with the state government, but that's where it comes from. County officials have independent authority that they can take on behalf of their own constituencies, and that's kind of baked into state law.
Gotcha. Ben asks, if he went from Arapahoe County up to Cheyenne, would he be able to get back into Colorado?
Yes, I don't think that would be a problem. I think two things. One, is it essential? That's a question, and that's a question you're going to have to analyze and answer. Two, I don't foresee barricades going up and people and the state wanting to spend resources on that kind of thing. I don't know if it could do that kind of thing. There's a pretty significant constitutional issue when state governments try to restrict travel interstate. There's a concept called right to travel. But again, I don't see that being a problem, assuming you're complying with the order. I can't give you legal advice. I'd say look at it, read your order, read the state order, and make an educated decision for yourself. But if you need to get out of state and get back, I think the order contemplates that and is designed to give that flexibility.
It is important to note that with the Tri-County Health Declaration, which covered Arapahoe, Douglas, and Adams County, that was rescinded based upon the governor's statewide. So I think some counties still have, like Boulder, I believe, maybe possibly Jefferson County, have still in existence their declarations and their orders, but the counties that were under the Tri-County order was rescinded.
And that's sensible. What you want, once the decision has been made that this needs to be done statewide, and you can disagree or agree with that, but once that decision's been made, consistency is important. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that prompted the governor's office to do this, is they saw patchworks going into place. There were going to be questions. It's better to try to address those questions in a centralized and uniform, consistent way, rather than having folks, under different restrictions.
This is a good question. If you have a second property, like a condo in Keystone, could you go do it?
Yeah, I think you can, particularly if there are reasons that you need to be there to deal with upkeep or other issues. If you've got a flood, for example, or there's maintenance you need to do, I think you can do that. Anecdotally, I've heard people doing that. So I don't read the order to restrict that. Anytime you leave the house, you obviously need to be practicing social distancing in accordance with the order, and that's an issue. But I don't read the order to say that you can't visit your properties and make sure that they're protected and safe and all those things.
So we mentioned Colorado state parks are open, so you could drive to a place to go take a hike?
That's the way I read it. State parks are open, city parks are open. City parks are subject to local authority. In fact, the order almost encourages you to get out to state parks, because I think the government understands that if you're staying at home, you need to get out and you need to go do something, and state parks are a great thing to do. So my read of the order is, yeah, you can travel to state parks and you can use those parks as long as you're practicing social distancing, not having a camp out, not having a cookout, not having a picnic.
One thing I did notice, and we've got a few questions on this order from the state is different than the order from Denver when it comes to the role of pastors and religious communities. So they were specifically listed in Mayor Hancock's order as an essential or critical business, and they were allowed to still operate as long as they didn't violate the gathering restrictions. So in this case, the change is in-person pastoral services for individuals who are in crisis or in need of end-of-life services, provided social distancing is observed to the greatest extent possible. So my reading of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, no pastoral gathering services, but could you still go to your church as a pastor to do a web broadcast so long as you abided by the social distancing requirements? So if you have someone there operating the camera and someone operating the audio and maybe someone leading worship, they just all have to remain 6 feet away from each other, but you could still go to your church to do that so that people could attend the services online on Sundays. Is that a good reading?
Well, I think the next sentence there says, and this is why reading these things is critical, houses of worship may remain open. You're encouraged to implement electronic platforms.
Oh, I missed that.
Smaller services, 10 or fewer congregates. I read that as saying if you need to be in-house to conduct electronic platforms and make those run, I believe that would be allowed. I think they're specifically thinking of that. And frankly, I think the folks who wrote this order would want you to be doing that so that people can remain connected and can worship the best way we can in this strange time. I'm just reading through a frequently asked question.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Also, and trying to find where that would be. But my read of it is, yeah, you can do that based on just that language in that second set.
Here's a good question. Do people need to have a letter if they're out and about traveling? Maybe they do work for a critical business and they get pulled over. Do they need to have any type of letter with them to show that they work for a critical business?
Boy, I haven't heard about that, Jeff. It would surprise me if that were a requirement. I haven't seen anything published on that. I think what is being asked of our public safety officers is they exercise some common sense and that they try to understand that this is an evolving situation. Certainly probably doesn't hurt that you have some email on your phone that you can show somebody. I would just be shocked that if it were absent a strange situation, and I'm talking about people who are for some reason, trying to resist this order or do something that is directly contrary to it, that you're going to see a public safety officer try to be obstructing people in that way. So I haven't seen anything that suggests that is required. I don't think it would be. It's perhaps something to look into, but if you are required for critical business, I think you can go.
Here's a good question. Can you have a friend over for a drink?
No, you can't. You can do it this way, and that's what folks are doing, is meeting up through webcams, I guess, and having a beer that way. But that's really the key, which is so hard for folks to wrap their head around. You take a walk in your neighborhood now, you see all your neighbors. You have to stay 6 feet away from them. You can't invite them into your house or into your yard to socialize. And that's really one of the main things that this order is trying to do. And it's one of the things that I think is difficult culturally because we want to come together in a time like this.
This is a good question. When does this emergency end?
So, I gave the date. It's April 11th. Is the stated end date. That can continue. We don't know. It's a policy decision that our elected officials are going to have to make. But for now, it's April 11th at midnight, and we're going to have to wait to see what they do. And I hope. You're not
Go
hearing
ahead.
the background noise, but
Nope. One thing I was going to point out was if you look at the very end of this, April 11th is the date, unless extended, rescinded, superseded, or amended. So superseded, could that be a federal ban possibly? What would supersede a state?
I don't think that's what they had in mind. If you'll recall, previous to this statewide order, there was a statewide order that required a 50% reduction in force at non-critical businesses. And at the beginning of this current order, it said that portion of the order is rescinded because now it's a full reduction in force. So that's what it's talking about there. I don't think there's any chance that the federal government is going to come in and try to do a uniform nationwide system. It's questionable whether they have that authority. They haven't tried it under current statutes for sure. So I don't think that's what they're talking about there.
Right. We got some more good questions. Can you go fly fishing?
Yeah, I think you can. You know, the order talks about outdoor activities, including snowshoeing and skiing and snowboarding, which is what most folks are doing right now. Although I did some winter fishing in Montana, and that's some of the best time to go. You can do that. You just have to make sure you're complying with the social distancing requirements.
Got to stay 6 feet away.
That's
How does
right.
this, here's another good question. How does this apply to children who go back and forth for custody?
That is a great question. I think those are all members of the household. That would probably fall under the legally required to travel. If you are under a court order that says you need to meet folks and you need to transport, that's what that's there for. That would be my read of it.
So if you're with the legal order of the custody arrangement you have, you're allowed to travel so that you can meet those requirements.
That would be my understanding, and certainly it would be worth an email or a phone call to your personal lawyer if there's any question about that.
Has this abridged the First Amendment right to peacefully assemble, Mr. Constitutional Scholar?
That is what is so fascinating about this situation. We've already abridged the rights of people to assemble for religious purposes, and clearly we're abridging their right to gather and speak. In a situation like this, the courts are going to be okay with that for as long as the emergency is real. That's where those limits would start to kick in if there was a hint, if there was a real evidentiary basis where you could say this is exceeding the bounds of what is reasonable given the state of the emergency. There just isn't much case law on it because a couple things. One, we're Americans, we want to come together and we want to do the right thing for the most part. And so folks are going to trust the government, at least to a certain extent, and try to abide by the policy decisions they're making, even though it means great sacrifice. And then two, I think there just isn't much appetite in the courts to second guess this. Now it has happened. There was a horrendous case that came out of California a long time ago where there was a quarantine order that clearly wasn't going to help anybody. It was just going to confine an illness and make everybody sick in a particular area. And to boot, it was racially motivated. And the court threw that out. I don't think anybody would say that that's what's going on here, and that's never going to happen here, I'm sure. But that would be the kind of situation where the courts would step in. And I just don't see this morphing into a situation where those kinds of questions legitimately get raised. I think everybody wants to be done with this, and they're going to lift it as soon as they believe it's safe.
I am going to, in the chat, put a website here where you can get more information. It's covid19.colorado.gov, not only on this order, but with regards to the frequently asked questions that he just talked about. You'll see it right there on the right side. And then testing, prevention, isolation, quarantine, all that stuff is there. They also have, looks like a live chat. They're asking people, if you have questions, don't dial 911, dial 211. And you can get, so all that information I've just put at the bottom of the chat box there. Can someone go to Home Depot to buy supplies to complete a home project?
My understanding is yes. I haven't been there.
Yeah.
But my understanding is yes, and you just have to stand outside and keep distance apart, and they're metering people at the door, at least in areas where I know they're open. I think that falls under the necessary household goods sort of exception. There's some cleaning supplies there. There's other stuff you can pick up. Home construction is allowed right now. And if you go out walking in the morning, if you have a neighborhood where there are people building houses or renovating, they're still going to work. And they're part of the critical businesses that are listed out in this order.
Can you still buy pot in Colorado?
You can. I don't know how critical that is to needs. I don't want to get into that policy discussion. I'm sure you all saw the news that Denver, when they announced, didn't make exceptions for liquor and marijuana establishments, and quickly there was a run on those stores. And I understand that there was concern that people were congregating, and it kind of worked against the purpose of the order. And so Denver lifted that restriction, and in this statewide order, critical retail includes, quote, liquor stores and marijuana dispensaries, only for the sale of medical marijuana or curbside delivery. So there you go.
So curbside delivery would be the ability to drive up and pick it up, I guess. Okay.
I think so.
Okay. Let me see if we have other questions here. Can landscapers keep working?
That's a good question. I don't know if they fall within the context of sort of home construction and things like that. I don't want to opine on that. I would read carefully the order and try to reach out to somebody in your local government who might be able to get an answer to that.
If you're having the interior of your house painted, can the crew still come in and paint?
That's again, I don't know. What the order says is that critical business is construction, including but not limited to skilled trades such as electricians and plumbers. I don't know how those folks could do their jobs if they can't enter your home, but I just don't know. Sorry, Jeff, I don't know the answer to that. And I think that's a question that needs to be put to a local office of your government that can help you answer that.
Media, if you are watching, we'd appreciate you asking the governor that question next time he hosts a press conference. Can mobile pet groomers still work? I've actually seen quite a bit of those in Highlands Ranch where I live.
Is that right?
There's got to be a good half dozen every time I go out for a run.
Well, then they must have read something somewhere, I would hope. I don't know. And I just want to emphasize, I got to be really careful trying to opine on specific situations. It gets kind of close to that line of trying to give out legal advice, and I just don't want to do that.
It is, I mean, there does seem to be latitude through this with regards to the care of animals.
There absolutely is. And that's in, that's in the necessary activities. And maybe it would help to kind of read that for folks. If I could just find it. It says engaging in activities essential to health and safety. That includes, but is not limited to, pets and livestock. And later on, it says, where was it? There was another provision, I believe, that talked about, leaving your home to take care of offsite livestock and pets and things like that. So obviously there's some consideration given for that. I just don't know, Jeff, if mobile pet grooming is within the scope of that. But you can certainly walk your dog. You can, quote, feed your barnyard animals and do those kinds of necessary activities.
Yeah. If you're doing construction work, outdoor employees, as long as they're not, or can outdoor employees be closer than 6 feet while doing essential construction work?
So what I will tell you what the order says about critical businesses. They have to comply with the guidance and directives for maintaining a clean and safe work environment issued by the state health department, any applicable local health codes, and they have to comply with social distancing requirements to, quote, the greatest extent possible. That's what it says. So you have to read that and make a judgment.
Good judgment call. Well, I think, what we're seeing is the challenge of, and I brought this up to Fred when we were discussing this call earlier. I think there's going to be a lot of questions, constitutional questions at the end of this, is what makes up an essential business. The essential business definition via a government is very different than an individual, because every business is essential to an individual. It's how you make your paycheck, your livelihood, how you provide for your family. And for the business to be picking winners or government to be picking winners and losers through all this is a real challenge. And we're going to see lawsuits. There was a lawsuit against the city of Denver because they didn't include gun stores in their directive, which they felt was a violation of their rights as well as the Second Amendment rights. So it's going to be, this is kind of the ridiculousness of all this, is that you've got to kind of parse out every single incident and see if it fits. If it doesn't fit, people want to be law abiding. They don't want to spread coronavirus, but they need to provide for their families. It's part of all the challenge on this. And I'm not going to ask Fred to get into all the constitutional complications of this, because tomorrow at 2 p.m., we're going to host John Caldera, the Independence Institute, and we're going to dive into kind of the freedom movement and the economic side. And he's been making those arguments that we've got to look at the broad implications of all these decisions. And so we'll discuss that tomorrow at 2, which you can watch on YouTube and on Zoom as well. But one kind of maybe final question to wrap this all up. And it gets into this picking winners or losers. It seems like Planned Parenthood and abortion is still considered an option at this point, even while elected surgeries are being asked to stop. In this order, is Planned Parenthood still allowed to operate?
Jeff, I don't know the answer to that, and I haven't looked into that issue.
Yeah.
But your point is well taken. I think that's the question for policymakers in the future is, this has prompted folks to think about a situation that we hadn't considered for over 100 years, really. I think the Spanish flu is really where folks are looking for precedent. I think local lawmakers, I think federal lawmakers are going to have a lot to think about when things start to get back to normal, and if they want to revisit state statutes and other policies that govern this kind of a situation. Right now, I would expect that most folks are just really trying to help their constituents answer these difficult questions that many of which we've received today. But there will certainly be discussion, I think, going forward at a local level, state level, and maybe even a federal level to start to think about those things, because there just wasn't any reason to do so, before the last few weeks when this storm hit us.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I've talked to other attorneys who are looking back, going back to precedent all the way from the Spanish flu to try to figure out contract-related issues as well. This is going to be, I think, a generational change in our country, similar to the way we've dealt with crises in the past. This will change America moving forward. And I think it's important for us to be vigilant with regards to protecting our rights, but also making sure that we preserve public safety. So let's summarize all this as we kind of wrap up here, Fred. There are essentially, in this order, an intent to get people to self-isolate. The government is not looking to chase you down and prosecute you unless really the offense, in my reading of this, seems egregious. But they want to get into basically 2 different categories: necessary activities for individuals and critical businesses for businesses. What are you allowed to do under this order as an individual? What kind of businesses are allowed to operate in light of the kind of critical business mandate? The governor and elected officials are trying to flatten the curve with regards to the amount of people that are overwhelming our healthcare system, suffering from COVID-19. But from our opinion, or at least from your opinion, they're not seeking to prosecute you. I have a different I believe that this is really serious, that you could get prosecuted for shaking someone's hand. I think there's a problem with that in this law, but they're not necessarily looking to chase you down to prosecute you on that. Is that a general overview and summary of this?
Yeah, I think you've got the order pretty well summarized from a broad level. The main message that is trying to be conveyed here is they want you at home as much as you can be, so that you're not exposing others and you're not exposing yourself to possible transmission. They want you to be able to take care of the things that you need to do to feed yourself, to get medical supplies, to work at home if you can. They want critical businesses to keep running. So they want grocery stores to be open. They want drugstores to be open and things like that. They want government to be able to meet the need of the emergency, which obviously is tremendously important right now. We need our public safety officers available. We need our ambulances running. In terms of the enforcement side, what I know is the Department of Public Safety of the state really appears to be saying this is serious and there are serious consequences to violating it. But the first goal, I think, is voluntary compliance and education. So I don't think that the intent of this is to frighten people into their homes and not to get outside and take advantage of the necessary activities provisions. So that's my read of it, based on both the order itself and the public guidance I've seen from the Department of Public Safety and the AG's office.
Great. We are getting a number of questions that we're not going to answer because they deal with biology and the actual virus itself. I do want to let you know I've asked an expert, a professor in biology at Colorado Christian University, to come on next week to answer some of these questions. And so we'll talk about that. We're going to get into the constitutional issues and the freedom movement and protecting the economy with John Caldera tomorrow. So we've got a lot of different areas to cover. But Fred, as far as going through this and helping us understand this order and what this order is about and what you can do and cannot do, you have been fantastic. I really appreciate it. We needed someone with expertise in the background, the history that you have, to be able to really just kind of walk us through and tell us what this is. That was the point of today's call, webinar. What is this about? What are we facing here? And all the little different nuances, all the different questions that we're going to face, we're going to have to work through. We don't have exact answers today, but Fred, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much. Please give my best to Katie. We're big fans of the conservative power couple that we have in you two, defending our rights and liberties. Thank you so much. Any final words from you?
I just thank you. My heart goes out to everybody. We're praying for our community and our nation and the world right now. We have a sick family member in Richmond and we're waiting for a test back. I am sure all of you are worried and scared about your health, about the economy. And I just want you to know that there are a lot of folks thinking of you right now, praying for you. And thank you, Jeff, for organizing forums like this where folks can get a little bit of information. I hope what I've given you is helpful. It's an emerging situation. It's not something that many folks were looking at before a couple weeks ago. But I hope we get through this safely, and I know we will.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. As we close here, I do want to just give one announcement and encouragement. If you have time on your hands, there is not a better time than right now to explore that associate's, bachelor's, master's, or even doctoral degree with Colorado Christian University. We have over 7,000 students online. 88% of them qualify for financial aid. We have over 80 programs you can choose from. The average class size, only 11 people. So this is, if you've been thinking about getting that degree, now is the time to do it with Colorado Christian University. Go to ccu.edu, get more information there. That's ccu.edu. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. We will be back tomorrow at 2 p.m., different Zoom number, but we'll be back on YouTube. If you go to youtube.com/Centennial Institute, we'll be on with John Caldera at 2, and then further webinars next week with biologists, with nurses, and with educators. So look for all those coming up here soon. Thank you all so much. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.